Hey everybody. We continue our chapter 8 discussion from the last week. If you remember, on the last time we talked about some of the issues related to the Mundell-Fleming model, and then how, for example, central banks are most important aspect of this economic policy, especially monetary policy in domestic economies and also today in global economy. So if we look at the issue of central banks, first tasks of the central banks in the 1950s and 60s were actually under government direction. They targeted full employment. So you can say in the 1950s and 60s and early part of the 70s, what we mean by this central bank policies and their tasks are government direction and under the guidance of government. And this targeting full employment is something that means the central banks should follow the government policy guidelines when they actually decided the main issues in economic policy. For example, full employment was in parallel with Keynesian and somewhat close to the social welfare states of the 60s and 70s. Those social welfare policies of the governments generally required them to provide as much as they can all these employment guarantees to the workers, and also the trade unions, working class organizations, and all of them were pretty much organized. And they actually, activists and social movements, social democratic parties, all of these groups, and also socialist alternative to capitalism, all of these developments generally put some kind of an actual pressure for the capitalist governments, and especially in industrialized states. They think that the central banks should actually target this full employment as the main economic priority, because most of the things are government regulated. For example, up to the early 1970s, we can say there was a fixed exchange rate that most countries, for example, when they accept the US leadership, they accept this US gold parity of 35 US dollars equals to 1 ounce of gold. And this fixed exchange rate system was somewhat correspond to this economic stability period of 1950s and 60s, and capitalism in industrialized world in the 1960s and 50s and 60s generally create enormous growth numbers compared to present day. So those 5-6% annual growth rates, sometimes 7-8% in different countries, were actually also provide necessary resources for governments and central banks to actually target full employment as a main priority in their economic policy. But this OPEC crisis, and when the United States no longer can compete with German and Japanese capitals in the 1970s, and especially after the 1973 OPEC oil crisis, there is some kind of a stagflation or stagnation in the industrialized world and Western capitalist economies. So when there is some kind of a criticism, when there was a criticism of these social welfare policies, and since because of economic recession and economic problems, a lot of revenues of governments generally fall short of to provide necessary resources for social welfare payments. So also, as we discussed in transnational production chapter, if you remember from the chapter 7, when the capitalist companies also choose to export capital and export their production facilities or sending their production facilities to cheap labor countries, especially to Asia and Southeast Asia. You can see after the 1970s, in the mid 1970s, there was a break from these social welfare policies. So when there wasn't enough resources to provide broad-scale social welfare policies to the workers and working class, we can say this full employment target or this priority for central banks of full employment was given up, or you can say decrease its power over the economic policy. So you can say (1970s), especially 73 oil crisis and ensuing recession in the industrialized world weakened this social welfare policies. So that crisis created the necessary conclusion for Keynesian and social welfare policies, and also a lot of economists started to criticize this heavy involvement of government in terms of economic regulation and interference of governments in labor markets, social welfare policies, and other economic regulations. So with those heavy criticisms and also the decreasing revenues, since most of the transnational corporations started to, you can say, send their capital and production facilities overseas market in order to compete with lower costs, you can say that gradually ended these social welfare policies in the West. So what we see in the early 1980s in terms of central banks, this issue of central bank independence came to fore in economic policy discussions. Why this central bank independence came to fore? Because most of the time the neoliberalism and liberal period, IMF and World Bank structural adjustment policy years, and also years of Washington consensus, started with Thatcher and Reagan in the 1980s in the Western world. The liberal ideologues, or you can say liberals, argued that there should be less government intervention and privatization, trade liberalization, cutting of social spending, and all those kind of issues that people get used to as economic policies and economic regulations before 1980s should be actually stopped or dropped by governments. They argue that free markets and free trade as a concept and as an element can only allocate the resources of human beings much more efficiently than other alternatives. Since in the 1980s, the socialist economies in the Eastern Bloc was in crisis, these conditions were perfect for neoliberal propaganda. And during those neoliberal years, economics became some kind of a technical issue, or they tried to resemble the discipline of economics as some kind of a technical specialty. And mostly it should be given or given up by the governments to the technical specialists. So with theoretical and mathematical formulas, for example, quantitative explanations of economics became much more important than the social side and political dimensions of economic policies. So if it is just a quantitative business, and if you can allocate the resources, scarce resources of among human beings much more efficiently through free trade and free markets, you can say after 1980s, this technical specialties of economics in the economists in the central bank became an important aspect of those economic policies in the 1980s or those years. So what is this new priority in 1980s central banks? These economists and their specific priority was targeting low inflation, because most of these countries, especially Western industrialized world, throughout those 1970s crisis, they actually suffered from high inflation and also stagflation, economic stagnation during a relatively high inflation years. So this issue of inflation and how to attack higher inflation numbers in the industrialized world became a priority. So low inflation numbers and they gave up this full employment target. So what this full employment target means, they gave up full employment target means actually most economists and central banks accepted this is a major turning point in history of capitalism and history of industrialized nations. They actually target to lower the inflation and cutting social spending, especially cutting social spending on social welfare, became one of the significant aspects of economic policy after the 1980s. For example, those economists argue that in the 1970s, one of the major reasons of this higher inflation, especially in industrialized and the third world, was extensive social welfare policies of governments and extensive government regulation of economy. They said most of the resources of governments actually allocated inefficiently to social spending, and they don't think these social welfare policies or social spending create efficient outcomes for markets corporations and overall economy. They said one of the reasons of too much government involvement and too much government social spending, what it created was inflationary pressures. So in order to prevent another kind of flare up of inflation, or in order to prevent inflation to rise again, they actually started to decrease government social spending. And most of the vulnerable population, especially from unemployed to handicapped to women and children who used to get most portions of the social welfare spending before 1980s, we can say they actually somewhat negatively affected from this. So what we see is monetary policy, central bank intervene economy in the 1980s became much more important and somewhat replaced the policies of 1960s and 70s. So this monetary policy of central bank to intervene economy is generally, since the days of Milton Friedman and neoliberals, they argue that since these issues are subject of technical speciality and only economists, especially liberal specialists and liberal economists, can understand the issues related to the problems of money supply and those issues of economic growth. So this monetary policy targets of central banks and how central banks can intervene to the money supply and how to create some kind of a balance between supply and demand in money markets became a priority. For example, what is the biggest tool of the government and central bank when they actually adjusted their policy targets, or when they actually intervene to the economy? The most basic one is the interest rates. So raising or lowering interest rates became some kind of a tool that central banks use to intervene in the economy or some kind of an instabilities in economy. For example, when central bank try to increase money supply in the economy, they lower these interest rates. So how they achieve this issue of increasing money supply through lowering the rates? For example, when they lower the interest rates, that means the interest rates, in as usual or in simplistic terms, we can say it's the price of money. Generally, in the market supply and demand determine the interest rate, but most of the time, generally, the private sector and also public banks, they generally take the leading role or take the central banks as the leader of determination of interest rate policies. So when you lower the interest rates, that means money became cheaper. So when these private banks, other and public banks, when they give credit to enterprises or private actors, you can say the cheaper money conditions means there will be much more money available for the people to consume or spend in the economy. So in this way, when central bank increase the money supply, that means they can put money to the accounts of people, or you can say pockets of people to spend. So you can assume it's little bit has some kind of an effect on the increasing of demand in the overall economy, and it can also increase slightly. It depends on the conditions of the country and the production orientation of that economy, but generally it can somewhat increase the inflation because of this increasing demand to commodities. So in order to decrease money supply in an economy, central banks increase interest rates. So what is this central banks increasing interest rates? That means, for example, if there is a high rate of inflation and there was too much credit going on to, for example, superficial or artificial consumption or luxurious consumption, or there is too much import demand in a country, for example, or if that country wants to attract foreign investment or foreign reserves to its country, generally central banks under those conditions decided to increase interest rates. Why they decided to increase interest rates? Because increasing interest rates means the price of money become expensive, and when you make your money much more valuable and less available for consumption, most people tended to put it in deposit accounts in banks, or they invest that money in banks or financial system because of these increasing interest rates, especially in bank accounts. People tended to, for example, divert much more resources to these bank deposits with the attraction of higher interest rates. So money supply, since there is less available money in overall economy, that somewhat achieved its intention of lowering the consumption levels and somewhat lower the inflation in overall economy, because there's less money available for spending purposes. So you can say under these conditions, when you increase interest rates in that kind of economy, it tended to increase savings. But it's also one of the negative things related to increasing interest rates because the getting credits from the banks and the banking system becomes much more expensive through these increasing interest rates. You can say that actually for enterprises and especially in the industrialized world, for corporations, getting credit becomes expensive. So when you make investments, generally most of the investors, especially in direct investment, for example, when you invest your money in a new enterprise or a factory or a new shop or new kind of facility, for example, most of the time the capitalist companies, first they think about their profit rates, how much profit they can get from this new investment, and so that they can, for example, pay these credit installments to the banks. So if profits or future profits are not that bright or positive compared to interest rates, for example, if interest rates in that economy is too high compared to the profit expectations of companies, then more than likely, rather than investing it into new factories or new investments, more than likely that money will end up in bank accounts for deposit purposes. So generally, sometimes it can decrease the investment patterns and new investments, this higher interest rates. So one of the significant aspects of this increasing central bank interest rates was some kind of an indirect outcome, we can say, is the relatively higher unemployment in that country, because if there is some kind of a lesser investment in overall economy, there will be less available jobs for people. So it has the reserve rates of banks in the central bank was another issue that the central banks can also influence this monetary policy and general economic policy of the country. What this reserve rate means is generally money that banks put in central bank reserves as a collateral to get banking license for their operations. So what these reserves main issue is, for example, when you open up a private banking institution or private bank in this capitalist economy, you have to put some kind of a reserve guaranteed payment into central bank reserves, because that's actually some kind of a de result that the central bank decides that then, for example, they can give you a banking license for all banking and financial operations in that country. For example, without those guaranteed payments to the central bank reserves, it is hard for a private banking institution to get license, because, for example, this is some kind of a guarantee if that company private bank get into default or bankruptcy. For example, not all the money in the bank, but especially some portion of those deposits guaranteed by the governments generally can be paid through these central bank reserves, which at the initiation of this private enterprise or private banking, they put it into the central bank reserves. So it's some kind of a collateral to get this banking license. So when central banks increase this reserve rates or reserve conditions for the banks, they could decrease money supply in the economy. This is like increasing the interest rates in overall economy. They directly influence the economic actions of these private actors in the market economies. For example, when this reserve rate is increased, much more amount of money has to be supplied to the central bank reserves. That means there will be less available money for credit for the private banking operations. So if there is a less credit available, that means price of money increases. It's also some kind of the same influence like the increasing of interest rates, because you lower the supply of money in the overall economy. So that means also it has a negative influence over the consumption patterns and consumption of the economy. It also tended to decrease the money available for credit. So in that way, it is not as influential as the interest rate policy, but as an alternative tool, it also can be used by the central banks to influence the overall money supply and actor behavior in the economy. As the third tool that we can talk about central banks and how they actually influence the economy policy through selling and buying bonds. Actually, before I forgot, when we talked about this, when they increase the reserve rate, we said, but when they decrease the reserve rate, it is the opposite conclusion or opposite effect. When you decrease the reserve rate for private banking institutions, that means like lowering the interest rates. It creates much more money for available credit, and it increases the consumption, and it decreases the price of money in the overall economy. So it is much more advantageous for the consumption and spending in the overall economy when they decrease the reserve rates of banks, because banks will have the opportunity to give much more credits to the consumers. So that is the opposite of increasing interest rates, like you can say lowering the interest rates. The selling and buying bonds is generally when central bank wants to decrease money supply or to take money out of the overall economy, they sell these government bonds. Most of the time, the most usual aspect of the government central bank policies in capitalist economies is when they actually get money for other purposes, for example, for government debts and in other conditions for government investments or if they want to decrease money supply, they can generally sell government bonds. It is some kind of a third tool compared to this reserve rate or interest rates in overall economy, but it also nevertheless affected the available money supply in the overall economy, because when the banking institutions or private actors, when they actually as some kind of a guaranteed installment payments in the future, when they invest their money in these government bonds and give these loans to the government through the central bank, that means available money for consumption credit and other purposes in overall economy will be decreased, because most of them will go to the reserve of the central bank as some kind of an price of those government bonds. So you can say generally it has some kind of a parallel effect, like increasing interest rates or increasing the reserve rate of banks when you actually decided to influence economic policy or market conditions. When central banks, it is much less traditional and exceptional under crisis circumstances. When central banks rebuy bonds on the market, as they did after the 2000 great financial crisis, for example, when they rebuy bonds from the market, they actually increase the money supply in the overall economy. Because with that kind of action, government actually provides money for banking institutions and private actors to actually consume or spend in the overall economy. So it has some kind of opposite effect of selling bonds. But as I said, traditionally, up to the 21st century, you don't see that action from the government. But starting from 2008, Central Bank of United States Federal Reserve, you see governments started to rebuy those bonds from the market as some kind of a tool to supply money into the economies. So I think it is enough for today. So next week we will continue this chapter 8 as major developments since 1950s in financial system.